Hello. Okay. Hello, everyone. If you could take a seat, we're about to start. I'll just wait for a few more people to come in the room really quickly. Great. So nice to have you back in a big room. I have the pleasure to introduce our next speakers. We've got Matteo Saccone from Jumpship and Jay Steen from Sweet J Tech on I Know What You Did Last Somerville. Please welcome them to the stage.
Hello, thank you, and welcome to I Know What You Did Last Somerville. So we're going to start with some introductions and talk a little bit about what Somerville is. So I am Jay. I was audio programmer for Jumpship on Somerville, and I'm now tech director of Sweet Tech, or Sweet J Tech, or just call it whatever you want. It's part of Sweet Justice, where we make video game audio technology, and right now we're working on some stuff for Unreal Engine.
Cool. And my name is Matteo Saccone. I'm the audio director at Jumpship and also one of the composers for the game Somerville. So what is Somerville? It's a sci-fi adventure game that's grounded into the intimate repercussion of a large-scale conflict. And I copy and pasted that from our Steam page. It's a speechless game since no words have been spoken, but it relies heavily on storytelling through animations, environments, and sounds.
So today we're going to talk a little bit about the game itself, if you hadn't had a chance to play it, to give you all some background in it. And Matteo's going to talk about the audio direction and the sound design aspects of the game. And I'm going to do some implementation and technical details talking, but we're going to try and put it all together and side by side it. So I'm going to start by talking about our influences. So you can't really talk about Somerville without mentioning Limbo and Inside. They were both big influences on the game, especially because we were under the executive direction of Dino Patti, who was part of Playdead and founded Jumpship with Chris. However, we did make a conscious effort to not ape those games too close, and we would have felt like we were being derivative of them. Plus, we had our own big ideas that we wanted to try out. The whole thing is steeped in War of the Worlds references, not least the quaint yet torn apart English setting, and that had a big impact on the audio direction as well. Also, the film Arrival. So the language of the aliens in that, they were called the heptapods in that, and our aliens are called the monolith. And their forms of communication, that formed a big impression on us. And the characters of The Last of Us and the Uncharted series, and basically Naughty Dog's human characters, were really influential on us. Like, you know, we were trying to shoot for that bar, but with less people and less time.
So yeah, regarding the audio direction, first of all, we wanted to approach Somerville more as a movie rather than a game, with a strong emphasis on a dynamic mix that is usually driven by a case-by-case scenario, rather than using hard fixed rules that are dictated by the game engine, and all on this to reinforce a cinematic storytelling. As I mentioned before, it's a speechless game since no words have been spoken, but we still make use of actors and to pretty much convey the emotions of the characters through breathings. And also we make use of atmospheric ambiances as protagonists most of the time, while the music is used very sparsely to increase the impact of it, while leaving more room for a more personal interpretation of the story.
Don't tell me how to feel.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm going to talk a bit about where we ended up with the audio tech. So first of all, we built the game in Unity, and we used Wise for the audio engine, and it shipped on PC, Xbox One, and Xbox Series XS. Yeah, all those. And we used a pretty vanilla version of Wise's runtime and editor with a few tiny modifications and fixes that we made in partnership with Audio Kinetic. So everything is built on top of Wise and the AK Sound Engine SDK that they provide. We used the editor and the pipeline side of the Unity integration pretty much unchanged, and we used it for everything. But we didn't end up using much of their provided runtime and component side of the Unity integration, as we found it was quite opinionated about how you make sound in Unity, and it meant we couldn't really do all the things we wanted to do. So instead of that, I wrote a layer called Jumpship Audio on top of Wise, which it wraps up a lot of Wise functionality into simpler API calls. It has custom object handling, so you don't need to use the AK object component to make things happen. And it also did bank loading and pausing events until banks are loaded, so that you never get that bank is not loaded error, which was awesome. And that was good, wasn't it? It saved a lot of tears. And then on top of that, we built a Somerville audio layer, which contains all of the game-specific features, such as the ambient system, the character foley, animation tagging, interaction sounds, and some more exotic systems that we'll talk about in a minute.
Yeah, but before we had any of that, we started by implementing audio using native tools from Unity and Wise, and of course the result was not really what we wanted. The audio experience was very inconsistent, and at times it was very noisy and confusing for the player. And in order to explain what that is, we are going to talk a little bit about the cameras. So the cameras in Somerville, they have a behavior that is not fixed, but it changes on a case-by-case scenario that is chosen by the director. For example, we have camera that have a fixed position. You consider them as being on a tripod, where the rotation is the only movement that's allowed. And in most of those cases, moving from one room to another happens with a quick cut or transition to show the next area. And we also have camera on rails, also known as dolly shots. And in a lot of those cases, they give a feeling of almost like playing a side-scroller game. But we also use that for other effects, like moving back and forth on the screen, and so moving through objects as well. We also have, lastly, the cameras that are free from movement restrictions, and they simply follow the player, similarly to what would you expect from like a third-person games. And this was mostly used on the early stage of development. And of course, for each one of these cameras, for each one of those camera settings, we can blend and transition between each other and seamlessly based on a distance, a location from the main character and the camera zones. So this begs the questions, who is the listener then in Somerville? And as I know, most of you people will know, the listener is what emulates the distance and position of the different audio sources. So it drives the volume attenuation, panning, reverb, occlusion, and so on. So in few words, we can consider it as being the virtual ears in our 3D environment. For example, in first-person games, the listener will usually be the camera itself, or in third-person games, it's somewhere in between the camera and the character. And at first, we tried placing the listener on the main character on screen, and that made character and object sound louder based on the distance between the main character and the object emitting the sound. And this was an issue mostly in areas where we had cameras stuck into a fixed position while the main character is moving around the screen, or in other areas where the main, pretty much where the main character is far away, like in this case. And if you're wondering where he is right there. And in this example, if we had objects close to the player, they will sound very up close, even though we can see them that are very far in the distance. And there is a little video example on how it sounded. So yeah, the next attempt was to place the listener on the camera itself. So that means that volumes are driven by the distance between the camera and the emitter. Now, though, what we found was that camera in Somerville make use of different lenses with different fields of view, and Jay's going to talk more about it later. But in a few words, on these two screenshots, for example, we can see that the character is somewhat at the same distance to the camera. But if we look at it from the editor on a top-down view, we can actually uncover that the camera on the right screen, on the right screenshot, is much closer. And that's because he had like a wider field of view. So this means that at times, even though a camera was placed at a certain distance, a specific set of lenses will make objects appear much closer or further away, so creating a lot of inconsistency with the audio across the whole game. So with this last try, it became quite clear to us that we had to take a little bit of a step back and look again to one of our audio direction pillar, which was to make it sound like a movie. But what does it mean? So in movies, we have not fixed the listener into a 3D world, but everything is placed by hand by the sound designer. And there's also like a mix that is done by hand. And the only decision that happens there is just driven by the storytelling that we were trying to do. So objects are not always louder based on their position on the screen. So with that in mind, we changed our approach when designing and implementing audio. So we started by using a more linear approach. So first of all, we would take a video of a playthrough, and then we would bring it into our DAW choice, which in our case was Reaper. And then we would edit the sound there and spend quite some time on a mix pass as well. And overall designing the sonic soundscape freely, focusing exclusively on storytelling, and without any strict rules and confinements dictated by the game engine. We would then do a breakdown and analyze how soundscape would change based on the storytelling decision.
And then we'd usually jump on a call together and discuss the ways it could be implemented. Then if it needed a new feature, which it often did, I would try and break those things down into something that could be part of an additional system, an existing system, or whether we needed an additional system for it. Then I would take this and implement it code side, while Matteo created some rough out WISE data to plug into it. And then I'd try and plug this in and figure out, actually, that's not the way it was supposed to work, and that I needed to rebuild the code. And then we'd finally achieve some clarity on what we wanted and have something that we needed, and I could make it work. I'd then check this first implementation into the game and hand over to Matteo and the other sound designers who could implement more if necessary. And then we just iterated until we ran out of time in the production schedule. So our first use of the sound design to system process was in this camera listener versus player listener. And in the end, we got to a place where we decided, why not both? So we wanted sound designers to be able to select which listener applies attenuation to a given sound. So we built a system within Somerville Audio to have one listener on the player and one listener on the camera. And they're always facing the same direction as the camera, even the one on the player, because we didn't want to have a weird thing where if the player turns around and then they turn back, they get a different mix. We didn't want that. So we used WISE's ability to assign override listeners to audio objects. And we just had a drop down on all of our sound players where you could select whether you wanted camera listener or player listener, and it would take the default listener off and put the camera listener on. So here is an example of it in game. So the reverb changes when the characters go into the sort of fridge area, and then the ambiences change when the camera moves in. So alongside that, we wanted to have some listener relative parameters sent to WISE. So what do I mean by that? Usually you'd mix the sound's attenuation based on its local forward direction, as if that sound was a loudspeaker. And when you turn a loudspeaker around, you get a little bit of frequency roll-off, you get some amplitude roll-off. But we found we also wanted to mix sounds based on the listener's forward direction. So as if it were like a directional microphone. So if you turn a directional microphone around, obviously you get some roll-off, some frequency and amplitude roll-off. So WISE doesn't actually have these listener relative parameters built in, so we needed to add them. And we found that it was best to split the angle up into an azimuth angle, which is basically like a flat plane. So this example here shows, like, imagine a flat angle from the front direction of the listener to the emitter, and also to elevation, which is kind of like how high up it is in an angle. And this is a side-on view of that. So we calculated those and sent them through to WISE and did some mixing based on it. They can be a little bit awkward to visualize, so we built some debug visualization. And so in this example, the TV is the emitter and the camera is at the center of that gray circle. And you can kind of see it's got a negative elevation there, the red bit's the elevation, and it's got a positive azimuth, so it's the green bit. And here's an example. spent a lot of time listening to snoring parents in that house, didn't we? So we, as I said, we had a lot of room-based soundscapes in Somerville, like that house, and some caves as well. So in theory, the Wise spatial audio plugin would have been great for us, and we tried it out quite extensively. But in practice, we ended up not using it so much. So it is actually more first-person focused than we realized, and we couldn't get the results we wanted while still having the two different listener perspectives, the camera and the player listener, because spatial audio only allows for one, and we couldn't choose. It was like being asked to choose your favorite child. So instead, we made use of camera mix value RTPCs. So Somerville makes use of Cinemachine for its camera system, and as part of Cinemachine, you can blend linearly between cameras, and those blend values made for just great normalized values to feed in to say, all right, how much is this camera being used right now? So we just fed them straight through as RTPCs.
Yeah, and this also allowed us to place a lot of sounds between the level itself, all playing at the same time, but then we would use the camera mix RTPC to then decide how to mix all the sounds based on where the character was, so based on which camera we were using. So we would just, turn down the volume of certain sounds, fake occlusion for some of them, and using different reverb sounds for each one of those sounds. Did we click both?
Oh.
Okay.
So, as Matteo mentioned earlier, with the camera listener, we quickly found that distance is not the only thing that should be driving the mix. So Somerville has a lot of different camera shot styles, which have different lenses, which mean different fields of view and how much you can see on the screen. So this meant that with wide-angle lenses, we could have characters and objects relatively close and appear somewhat small on the screen. And with narrow-angle close-up lenses, you could have characters and objects far in the distance but appear really huge on screen. And so that gave us that inconsistent mix that Matteo mentioned. So to get around this, we sent a size-on-screen normalized value RTPC to Wise to help with cinematic mixing for things that appeared in multiple scenes that had different camera lenses, but we wanted to have the same sounds playing on them. So also for this, we used the height coefficient of the screen because it was the best proxy for perceived size and simpler than calculating the area of the screen with changing resolutions and things like that. We just use height. So.
Yeah, and with this tool, we could then drive the volumes and reverbs of our main character, for example, Foley and the breeding. So all of it was based on its size on screen. And so we pretty much faked the 3D perspective, even though the sounds in Wise were set to be 2D. So with no actual spatialization.
And also to fully realize that cinematic mix, we needed to know when something was in shot, i.e. when it was on screen. And it also helped to know how in shot that is, as it helped us focus the mix on things that are not peripheral to what's going on. So for example, in this top-down example view, if you just use distance attenuation, the red square sound would be as loud as the green triangle sound, even though it's not all in shot. In fact, the red square is not in shot at all. This would be fine, for example, in an FPS, because you want to know when things are near you off the screen, but it's not important to our game, our cinematic mix, as there are very few off-screen things that you really need to know about, or at least need to know about at the same level. So we define for a given sound a safe zone in screen space, where the RTPC value is 1, and the value interpolates off that safe zone to 0 at the edge of the screen. So this allows us to add maybe an additional attenuation of 6 dB that things go off. And as that green triangle would be no attenuation, and then as the red square moves off the edge of the screen, it would linearly fade down 6 dB or so. And I love dial tones. You can see that little yellow circle you can see now is the point we were using. So lonely using that as a debug tone. Yeah. Sorry, I've started your thing.
Oh, okay. So yeah, I thought I would put a nice recipe for the next grocery shop. So you can get some cabbage, some chard, fennel, flour, oranges, peppers, rice crackers, and why not some rotten wood and some rubber as well, and cellophane. And if you cook it up all together, put in your dough choice, stretch it up a little bit. In our case, we got some cool alien sounds. So this is how some of those sounds were used in the game, and then we'll talk how they've been implemented. So yeah, let's talk a little bit about some of the sounds were implemented. So one of the core gameplay mechanics is the ability to liquefy and solidify an alien substance that we call it the sediment. The rate of how fast it melts depends on the strength of the light source that we're using and the distance between that and the sediment itself. In WISE, we use a blend container with different layers of audio, and which are the recordings that we mentioned earlier. And we just use one RTPC to drive things like volume, pitch, and filter, and which one to each one of the samples. And it sounded so disgusting that we called it the gross machine. And this is how it was sounding in WISE. I like to do a little bit of jump scares.
Got me. So yeah, how do we implement it? So it just so happened that I also wrote the gameplay system that allows the player to melt the sediment. And this uses voxels and raycasting from a light source. There's actually an article up about it on the Somerville Steam page if you want to go check it out. It's really cool. So this meant we could really make the most of the voxel melting by adding hooks that notify you when any sediment is being melted. So we used that for audio, and also VFX ended up using it. So sediment audio had a problem in that sediment chunks are area sound sources rather than point sources, or like volume sources. So the default WISE attenuation doesn't really work. The center of the sediment chunk, or like the position of it, could be a long way away from the stuff that's melting, as some of the chunks were huge compared to the player, including that tunnel that you saw the character melting through at the end of the game. So to get around this, we used a feature of WISE called multi-emitter game objects. So the example WISE give for the usage of this is like multiple torches burning in a dungeon, and you only play one sound, and it saves CPU usage, which is great and all. But we kind of flipped that on its head and nitro-charged the CPU usage of it. So we did that by supplying a position of each voxel of the sediment who was being melted, and this basically formed a point cloud of source points, and then we applied WISE's attenuation to that. So as sediment voxels get melted away or stop melting, they stop being part of the point cloud, so the sound's attenuation field changes dynamically. And it was a pretty simple solution to write in the end, and it made quite creative use of one of WISE's features, not really intended for that, but yeah, I was quite pleased with it. And if you're interested in the maths, it forms a Minkowski sum of the attenuation sphere and the shape of the sediment. So I like talking about the maths bits. So yeah, we also had to realize the creatures, the alien creatures, and the stalkers, or they were called alien dogs online by people, so we like kind of calling them that now. And the drones, which are the little cute rolly things, they were all procedurally rendered and animated. There were no 3D models for them or anything, so we were unable to use animation techniques, tagging for them. So we had to rely on procedural Foley for generating the sound. So to do this for the stalkers, we measured the angular velocity and acceleration of the stalkers' heads when they were moving, looking around. and we use this information to trigger and modulate their vocal sounds. The walking animations for the stalkers or alien dogs were also generated procedurally using just raycasting. So we adapted the human footstep system that we had to listen for raycast hits and animation cycle points and play sounds at that point. Thankfully, with the drones, it was a little simpler because we just had to detect how fast they were rolling. So for both these creatures, and actually for all of the footsteps, we tagged all of the surfaces in the game with a wise switch value, which just told us what the surface was, and then that could be used to drive a switch container to play different sounds. Although on top of all of that, sometimes we just had to cheat and use pre-baked scripted sound sequences when we needed those cinematic moments or big bombastic gameplay moments to really pop. So here's some examples of those things. This is the stalker here. This is the drone rolling around, I think.
Mm-hmm. This one is for the drone head rotation.
One of my favorite sounds you made with the gross machine was those little blink sounds.
Yes. Like, yeah. Actually used animation tagging for that.
Oh, you did? Oh, there we go. See.
A little bit of both.
So humans are also another kind of creature in the game, and unlike the others in the game, they need to breathe. So this is a big part of the performance of the characters as well.
Yeah, we should also first thank Christopher Tester and Ali Murphy for breathing life, pun intended, into our character. They were our only two actors for the whole game, and so pretty much they recorded themselves while we were in a video call, and you know what they were doing, breathings while running at different speed. So going from being tired to going from not being tired to going completely out of breath. We then chopped each single breath in and breath out, and we categorized them in Ys for level of tiredness, type of action being performed, like if they were running, walking, or standing still, or vaulting, doing also a different type of actions, and also for different type of emotions, because the character can be relaxed, they can be scared, hurt, or also they can be chased.
And so in terms of how we implemented the breathing, human characters use a breath sequencer, which makes use of the Wise callback system to know when a sound is finished. So on the code side, it tracks whether an inhalation or exhalation is taking place, and it sends this to Wise using a switch. And then whenever an inhalation finishes, it switches, flips the switch, and plays an exhalation sound next. And then when that finishes, it goes back around. So the sequencer allows specific event interruptions to come from an animation trigger. For example, when John is landing from a big fall, a big oof plays, and the sequencer sequencer then resets after this back to an inhale. So we found that we would always reset to an inhale because it sounds kind of bad if you go oof, and then the next thing the character does is go. Your lungs can't really do that. So yeah, we always went back to an inhale. And the breathing can also be paused. So when the character is underwater, like when they're swimming underwater, they can't breathe, so we stop it then. And it can also be forced to pause by other cinematic things in the game. So we implemented a tiredness RTPC based on how fast the character is running and how fast they can run at top speed as well. So it actually holds at lower levels of tiredness for slower max speeds. So you don't get big, heavy, heaving breaths when the character's just going for like a brisk walk. And we also implemented emotions as a switch, just a simple switch container in Wise based on trigger zones in the game. And these allowed us to enhance the character performance even more and make them sound like scared, relieved, exhausted, ill, so on, whatever the cinematic context of the game called for. And here is an example in the caves. There's some breathing. Strangely satisfying when he gets his breath back, isn't it? It's like, cool. Yeah, so to even more fully realize this, we were able to work with the awesome jump ship animation team to split breath cycles into a separate animation layer. And this was driven by the progress through the breath sounds. So every time a breath sequence or event starts, we get a callback from Wise with the length of the sample that's been selected, which allowed us to track on the game code side a normalized value of progress, which we then sent to the animator. So this meant that like fast panting breaths and slow relaxed breathing could all sync up perfectly with the animations. And we only ended up using a single animation set and layer to overlay that on top of the other animations that the character had.
Yeah, from the character's clothing foley, we took a procedural approach of detecting relative velocities of the arm and the elbow bones to the hip bone. And then we send this information via RTPC to Wise, and we'll draw the attenuations and the texture of the clothing foley sounds. This also freed us a lot from having to tag each single animation, and we also used a wetness RTPC parameter to switch between the foley for the clothing and the swimming. So yeah, and also this wetness RTPC would also interpolate over time after John, our character, gets out of the water to simulate drying over time. And there is a little example. It's not really exciting one. So.
I'm providing. And for everything else, there's animation tagging. So there is a built-in way in Unity to add events and tags to animators, but it's quite error-prone and fiddly and time-consuming. It's often hard to discover the animations that you need to tag as well. So alongside this, we built a workflow that adds events to animations and converts them so that they'll work with the audio animation event runtime system. And this also allows the sound designer to select which Wise event they want to be played on that animation. It saves a lot of time authoring and also a lot of debugging time trying to figure out why isn't this animation event playing? Like we got to those pretty quickly. So it was awesome. I would recommend it. And we've talked a bit about characters. We're going to talk a little bit about the environments now. So we had a pretty backbone system called audio environment zones. And that was, as I said, it was like the technical bedrock of our ambient system. Fundamentally, they're built for playing in an ambient bed sound when the listener is within the roll-off distance of a spatial volume. And fading that sound up between the edge of the roll-off and the defined shape. And as with the sediment, we encountered an issue with this where Wise's attenuation is based on point sources. It can't really be applied easily to volumes. So we wanted to be able to fake an area volume roll-off. So we passed the distance between the edge of the roll-off zone and the interior of the shape as a normalized value through an RTPC, which could then be used on the Wise side to smoothly fade in the ambient bed. as the player gets closer to the boundary of the sound. And it could also be used for other things. So it could be used to change global RTPCs that could be affected by just specific audio environment instances in the level.
And yeah, so similar with what we did with the camera mixes, we use global RTPC. So we still have some areas like a lot of the sounds, we will actually put it into almost to the entirety of the level. And then we would use this audio environment zone to kind of remix all the sounds for the ambiences, giving a little bit of a feeling of, having a mix changing and kind of going through the story a bit more.
For those interested in the maths again, this is another Minkowski sum of a sphere and the shape that you define. I really do love Minkowski sums. You should check them out. So audio environment zones, they were also used to set states. So the music system, for example, just plays an event, and then states were used to initiate cues. And we also used them to set general mix snapshots for different levels. They were also used to set reverb sends. So we had quite a few different impulse responses. I think we shipped with 15 possible ones in the end. To achieve that sonic sense of place that we wanted to in Somerville. And the sound designers could use audio environment zones to choose which of them are used and blend it together using that tech. We originally built a priority system. We thought we needed this for the sounds. So you would manually set priorities, and that would cause more important audio environments to duck the sounds of less important ones. We found that in practice, we didn't really need it. It didn't end up working like that from an artistic point of view. However, because of Wise's limit of 4 active impulse responses due to valid CPU concerns, we used the prioritization system to ensure that only the 4 most important relevant impulse responses are applied. And we made use of 2 different zone shape types for audio environments, boxes and polygons. So here's a demo of the polygon shape tool being used to cover a custom space in the caves. And that works by defining a 2D shape and then having a height control that's the same across it all. So these 2 types provided flexible enough to cover the whole game, even though other types were available, like spheres and cones and things like that. And we didn't end up using them. These were just good enough, basically. So here's a little video showcasing the use of audio environment zones, playing audio and driving global RTPCs to change the mix.
So yeah, let's talk a little bit about the monoliths beams, and here's a little video to go with that. So as we have those purple monolith beams sweeping across the map, we wanted objects in the world to interact with them in order to give a sense of urgency and also alert the player of the incoming danger. And we did so by placing a few audio objects in the map. And we created a component that we could then attach to a few of those objects, which will then take in consideration how close to the threshold of a monolith beam each one of them was. And with such components, we'll then send its value through an RTPC to the Wise game object, so that sound could then be modulated over time. And here are some examples.
Jay, do you want? Oh, yeah, sorry. So the distance to the threshold was calculated by, so the monolith beams were pyramid shaped. So it meant we could just use a straight up frustum test like you would do for camera culling. And we allowed each sound to test against the beams and say, are you inside or how close are you to this frustum? So here's a video example of that happening as well. So we should also talk about interactions and their sounds, since it was pretty much all one of our sound designers did for most of the project. So, there he is right there. It was the biggest audio system in the game by instance count, which there were 380 individual interactions. That's so much audio, so much work. And it encompassed everything that you grab, push, move, turn, pick up. Basically, all the puzzles in the game use this system. And the audio code system for it was not really designed for such scale. So interactions became progressively more important through the production cycle, and the system started to creak under the weight of what was on it. But it did ship, and thank you for all your patience when working with it. So this is some of the characters' favorite interactions in the game. Got to make sure they're on. So the gameplay side of this system is all powered by a single value moving from 0 to 1 as the player interacts. So it made sense to use this value to trigger audio as well. We sent it as an RTPC, but we wanted to play events based on it changing. And there were two kinds of change we wanted to detect. So when the number's going past a threshold value, for example, when it goes below that orange line, we play an event. And also when the rate of change of the number goes above a certain amount. So we would use this for movement sounds typically. So in this video example, John's moving the lever and it's playing a success sound, which is a threshold, and then a value delta sound for the movement. Oops, I skipped it. So that's the threshold there, triggering that clunk. And that's the movement sounds on the value delta. So it was really buggy and really fiddly to set up to use this system. And I kind of wouldn't recommend it, although maybe if we'd planned it better, I would. So there's my...
Thank God we only had 380 of them.
It's true, it's true. It could have been 3,800. And yeah, so some interactions were driven by animators rather than the interaction system animated components. So for this, we reused the characters audio animation event tagging and applied it to not characters. And yeah, we could just slap a component on things that have that and make it work. And here's my favorite example of it in use: when nature calls in the festival. Have you ever seen or heard a more beautifully animated toilet door? Definitely not me. So to round up, we have talked about our cinematic storytelling and how we achieve that in game. We've talked about the speechless characters and creatures, and we have talked about our atmospheric ambiences and all the things that go along with that. And so we're up here taking all the credit, but all of these folks up on screen also contributed hugely to the sound of the game, and we loved working with them very much. So thank you, everybody. And with that, that's us. Do we have any time for questions? Yeah. No? Oh, no.
Yeah?
Okay. A couple? Oh, no. Well, come talk to us afterwards. We'll be here. Yeah. It's cool. Thank you.
We'll also be at the drinks tonight as well,
yeah.
so definitely see us there.
Cool, thanks.